Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 65 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Colbo snorted and pawed in excitement. Janir kept him reined, waiting for the others. Rain pelted them from above, soaking through Janir's thick woolen cloak. There had been some discussion as to whether they should wait, but it had been raining since yesterday, with no signs of stopping. Janir had not been so certain about taking Colbo on another journey when he had just completed one. Armandius told her it had been an easy journey for the stallion, but she hadn't been sure. Now that she was having to hold the stallion back, she felt much better. Carlisle hunched beside her on his shaggy gray pony. The animal more resembled a sheepdog than a horse. Agu, as Carlisle called him, stood still, save for his overlarge nostrils flaring at Colbo. With a few hairs from a comb of Gwenna's, enchanters in Laris's temple had managed to make a Soulseeker. Janir hadn't been permitted to witness its creation. She wasn't trusted nearly enough. Nevertheless, Carlisle had been more than happy to regale her with a painfully detailed description. Janir could even now sense it, a topaz, crystalline magic beneath the enchanter's robes. Carlisle was the only one of them who could properly wield the Soulseeker. It was also their only means of finding Lady Gwenna. At present, it was pointing them in the direction of the eastern mountains. The enchanters who made the Soulseeker had also successfully conjured an image of Lady Gwenna's current location. Janir wasn't told the details. Armandius didn't seem to think she needed to know, but it was understood that it was a temple somewhere in Tathansia. Tathansia had been settled generations ago by refugees from the Burning Lands across the sea. They had mostly kept to themselves, building towns and small cities within the rainforest. It was said the ancient sequoias and tangled rivers were not so unlike the jungle homes of their ancestors. Armandius was still standing beneath the shelter of the stables, speaking with Velasquez, Lord Veladaman, and Lord Vergard. Their words were drowned out by the somber drone of the rain. Saoven and Luana checked the saddlebags and gear of the horses one last time. Janir watched them, noticing, not for the first time, how at ease Saoven became around his aunt. Luana might seem austere and strict, but there was something that endeared her to her nephew. Saoven stood carefully, his ankle and shoulder still on the mend. He must have felt the Argatalam's eyes on him because he looked up from his work and smiled. Something warm curled in the pit of her stomach. Janir wondered what it would be like to kiss someone, Saoven particularly. It wasn't the first time the idea had occurred to her, but she felt she shouldn't be thinking it when other people were around. She looked away hastily. If Carlisle noticed the brief exchange, he was merciful enough not to comment. Armandius took his leave of the other lords with a bow. He accepted the reins of his dappled stallion from a stable hand. A few moments later, Velasquez, Luana, and Saoven were each aboard their respective horses. Only the 6 of them and 20 of Armandius's men made their way from the courtyard. It had been decided their group would assess the situation and send for aid if needed. They moved at a slow pace so as not to let the horses slip on the moistened cobblestones. Their hooves made sloshing, clacking sounds. The road led from the stables toward the main courtyard, and from there to the castle gates, which led into the city. It seemed eerie that they left unannounced and unnamed, only a handful of damp guards and a few miserable alley cats to witness their departure. Janir felt the world had gone into mourning, and it was not an encouraging thought. The horses plodded through the streets of Laris. No one spoke, the hoods of their feudal cloaks cutting them off from one another. Most of the city's citizens took shelter while the storm passed. Far overhead, the sky rumbled. Kalbo's ears twitched uneasily, but he stayed in the column. The riders made their way from the city gates and soon found themselves crossing the open plains toward Tathansian mountains. The wet grass lashed at the horses' legs, and the pelting rain continued. Janir pulled her cloak further over her face in an effort to shield herself from the wind that wailed outside the city. Kalbo lowered his head against the driving rain. The riders could only hope the rest of their journey would be easier. Briefly, Janir remembered the young healer who had been assigned to her in Adasha, Janvissa. Janvissa was Tathansian, taken as a slave during a raid on her village. When Janir had been her charge, Janvissa had been nothing but kind and caring. Were all Tathansians so kind? If so, Janir pitied them. The Argatolums were no doubt in Tathansia right now. Argatolums had no use for kindness. Traveling through Brevia incognito was surprisingly easy. Armandius allowed Velasquez or Saoven, or, on occasion, Luana, to do the speaking for their group when they were unfortunate enough to be stopped by town patrols. Even Armandius's soldiers had been stripped of their identifiable emblazons. Janir had ample time to rue having spoken up back in Lares. First when they were caught in a snowstorm out of season. Then when they became bogged down in a swamp, and nearly every night when they slept on the damp, cold ground. Janir focused on completing her tasks, keep moving, don't complain, and refused herself the luxury of self-pity. When they stopped to rest, Kalbo let his head hang low. Janir noticed that was true of all the horses and the people too. The early spring made traveling almost as brutal as the winter, but they had no time to wait. Travel-worn, Janir found herself feeling self-conscious in front of Saoven until she realized he fared no better. Everyone wore a mixture of mud and sweat. Their numbers roused suspicion from many a farmer and villager who might have otherwise offered them shelter. A few were still kind enough to feed the animals and allow their riders to camp in the barn for a few coins. It wasn't long before Janir grew to appreciate dry hay as well as she would a steaming bath. Kyle was unusually quiet. Only when everyone else was out of an earshot or engaged in their own conversation did he resume his usual banter. In addition to the task of taking on, as far as they knew, the most powerful enchantress in existence, he kept mentioning the prophecies he found in the antiquated holy texts. What was this reference to a bird of prey, and how could it be stopped from unleashing the tide of blood? Could it be stopped at all? The whole subject struck Janir as rather depressing. Armandius kept Janir and Saoven apart whenever possible. He made sure someone sat between them, that he or someone other than Kyle was always well within earshot, and most importantly, that they were never, ever alone. Janir resented him for that far more than she would say. She supposed he meant well, but Saoven had been there for her when no one else was. Saoven himself took Armandius's interference rather well at first, but as time wore on, Janir wasn't so certain. He tried to discuss the matter with Janir several times, but something always interrupted them. A fortnight from Lares, Janir was cold, hungry, and tired. All things that had become commonplace over the past few weeks. It was not raining, but a chill wind laden with moisture whipped up in their faces. Their immediate goal lay before them, a small village comprised of several thatched houses shuttered against the wind, a smithy, a tanner, a weaver, and their destination, an inn. The horses' hooves squished in the mud, sinking to the fetlock with every step. A few brave lights flickered and smoke curled from chimneys, but it appeared the village's inhabitants were wisely shuttered. Velasquez went into the inn to pay for a few rooms, while the others took the horses to the stables. Kalbo groaned with exhaustion as Janir slid off his back and undid his girth. When she slid the saddle free, she noticed patches where the hair had been worn. She would have to find something to pad the tender spots before they turned to sores. No one spoke as they each worked to rub down their respective mounts. Janir was sure she heard Carlisle's stomach rumbling. Even from the stables, they could smell the sweet, torturous odors of roasted meats and hot stew. Janir's own belly wrenched and twisted, demanding to be fed. After rubbing Kalbo down, Janir picked out his hooves, marveling once again at how much could fit in the circle of his iron shoes. She took her time tending the horse, making sure that he was comfortable and giving him an extra ration of oats. Before Armandius saw, she set to helping Saoven tend one of the stout pack horses. Saoven didn't smile, he was just as tired as she was. Yet his expression softened, gaze lingering on her for an extra moment. Their hands brushed, reaching for the girth strap. That shouldn't have sent a jolt through her, but it did. Once all the horses were fed, unsaddled, and rubbed down, Janir, Carlisle, and Saoven, along with 20 men, made their way inside the inn. They shuffled through the front door in their damp and mud-splattered state, bringing with them a good deal of dirt, but it seemed they weren't the first to do so this evening. The room that served as the inn's tavern was well populated with patrons, ranging from toothless farmers to youths and maids barely into adulthood. The atmosphere of the room was bright enough, even if it was by no means festive. A few people laughed, but a few also sat hunched close together, speaking in low voices. The walls were marked with stains, attesting to years of eventful nights. A chipped counter at one side served as a bar, and a frazzled serving girl bustled this way and that. The stench of unwashed bodies underlined the rich aromas of cooking food, but Janir was too hungry to care. A ravenous fire at one end warmed the whole of the room, and a wispy boy stirred a cauldron with a ladle that was almost as long as he was. The soldiers dispersed into the room, filling it nearly to capacity. Most of them had their own coin, and soon gold was flashing in the hands of the village girls. Janir supposed she shouldn't have been shocked, but Armandius watched several of his men take girls back to their rooms and didn't bat an eye. It was acceptable for soldiers to bed random villagers, but essences forbid Janir hold hands with someone she loved. Oddly, it occurred to her that no one would have cared in Staspen. As an Argotolum, she could take what lovers she chose. Velasquez waited at one of the rugged tables. He had already had bowls readied for them. Soon, Janir found herself carefully spooning warm beef stew into her mouth and trying to ignore the oversalting. Carlisle ate as much as Armandius and Velasquez put together, but did it so cleanly that one hardly noticed when he went back for his third bowl. Janir wondered again if Carlisle might have some vicious worm gnawing away at his entrails. The enchanter returned with another steaming bowl and lightly set it down. Armandius and Velasquez were discussing routes to Tithansia again, and Luana was listening. It seemed that they were less than 2 days' ride from the fringe of the rainforests, but who knew how long it might take them to reach the unknown temple from there? Janir was looking to the rainforests as she would her execution. She had no desire to trek through the treacherous wilds of Tithansia, but she wanted it over. "Those men over there, the ones smoking the pipes?" Carlisle discreetly motioned over his shoulder. Janir followed his gaze to a small group of shabby figures puffing clouds of smoke into the air. They appeared to be nearing the end of their better years and hunkered close to the fire. Saoven pivoted his head from his place next to Carlisle. Armandius had taken the spot beside Janir, and since she was seated at the end, Saoven couldn't be on her other side. "Yes?" Janir acknowledged with a slight nod. "They're merchants from the sound of it. They say there's been a band of dwarves through here recently. Warriors. Stocking up on supplies." Janir frowned. Dwarf craftsmen and artisans often traded with mortals, but seldom this far from their far northern mountain ranges in Relicia. A band of warriors on their way to the rainforests was most unusual. "Did they have any idea why?" Janir whispered. "Didn't sound like it," Carlisle replied. "Did they mention how many?" Saoven pressed. "Not exact numbers, but it seems there were a lot of them." Janir frowned. There was some connection she was missing, something stored in her mind involving dwarves, the Slavish, and Zamarza, but it flickered just out of her reach. You and your talent for eavesdropping, Saoven muttered. There was no accusation in his voice, only a slight teasing note. Ah, but what a useful talent it has proven to be, Carl countered. Indeed. She wasn't sure why she laughed. There had just been something in the way Carl said it. Armandius briefly shot a glance in her direction before resuming his conversation with Velasquez. He must have thought it was Saoven who made her laugh. The man could be so bloody. This can't be good, Saoven muttered. Why? Carl frowned. Do you think they're helping her? Saoven shrugged, scraping his spoon on the bottom of his bowl. It hardly matters. Why? Janir asked. Dwarves cannot be trusted. Janir had seen ample demonstration of the animosity between elves and dwarves. At the same time, she, of all people, could appreciate what it was like to be judged strictly on one's heritage. Have you ever taken the time to talk to one? Saoven frowned. I don't have to. Janir was taken aback. Prejudice ill-suited him. It was Carlyle who rescued her. My grandfather hated invulnerables with every fiber of his being. They carried off his twin sister. Carl stared straight at Saoven, voice flat and cold as an iced lake. He never found out what happened to her, and he taught everyone around him to loathe them as much as he did. Carl paused. Everything I'd ever known told me they all lived for killing and hurting. The enchanter took a deep breath. Then I met Janir. He briefly glanced to the Argotala maiden before turning back to the elf. And I think one thing you and I can agree on is that she's the kindest soul either of us knows. Saoven was quiet. He studied his emptied bowl. His brow furrowed in consideration, but he didn't reply. As had become their custom, Velasquez had simply taken the 3 largest rooms the inn had to offer, and everyone had piled in. Since no one wanted to sleep in the bed while everyone else was on the floor, the thing was pushed up against the wall to make more space. After traveling for so long, Janir hardly noticed the hardness of the floor and simply appreciated being out of the elements. Their fire crackled merrily in the sooty fireplace, filling the cramped room with meager warmth. Carl lay bundled in the corner, snoring in moments. Some nights he snored so loudly that Velasquez would kick him awake and swear to run him through if he didn't stop those infernal pig noises. Armandius slept rigid on his back and hardly ever moved from closing his eyes to waking. Luana curled into a ball like a kitten, while Velasquez did an unusual amount of tossing and turning. Janir lay in her blankets with one arm rolled under her head. She stared up at the ceiling, watching the fire's dancing patterns. She pondered what would happen when they found Gwenna. She didn't doubt that they would. It was just an eventuality. Would they be able to save her? Feeling someone's eyes, Janir turned her head and found Saoven, lying just a few feet away. Janir rolled onto her side to face him, enjoying the way the flickering light highlighted the planes of his face. For a long time, they stared at one another. What would become of them? Was there any way this could end well? As if he sensed her fears, Saoven reached out and touched her cheek. He traced the side of her face, caressing her brow. Softly, he ran his fingers along her jawline, brushing her chin. His touch calmed the storm inside her, soothing her like a healing balm. She wondered if she made him feel the same way. Did all his troubles seem to fade to nothingness when she was close? Janir again thought about kissing Saoven, but it couldn't happen. Not now. Who knew what Armandius would do if he caught them? Saoven lightly picked up her hand. Janir entwined her fingers through his. She began wishing things were simple, wishing that she and Saoven could spend a lifetime never having to concern themselves with the woes of kingdoms, enchantresses, or wars again. From the way he looked at her, Janir was sure Saoven was thinking the same thing. Janir tore her cloak free of an offending bramble bush and forced her way forwards, leading Kolbo close behind. Since entering the rainforests yesterday morning, the going had become slower and slower as the rainforest thickened. Since lodging in the wayside inn 3 days ago, the landscape had drastically changed. The trees had become larger, their foliage thicker, and their bark smoother. Creeping vines had become ubiquitous, and it had rained twice. 2 days ago, they had sought directions in a small trading village. The village elders assured Armandius that there was indeed a temple concealed in the wilderness of Tithansia. According to the villagers, the temple was along the river, 50 miles behind the rainforest boundaries. They supposedly would reach a waterfall and from there be able to see Tarkoth itself. Tarkoth was allegedly a den of hospitality for pilgrims and travelers alike. Thus far, Janir had not seen anything hospitable about Tithansia. At night they heard strange birds and who knew what other kinds of creatures hooting and screeching in the darkness. By day, they wrestled the landscape in an effort to keep moving. Regardless, the Soulseeker guided them toward the same path. They were headed in the right direction. Armandius left the 20 men at a Brevian outpost on the outskirts of the forest. The fort was under the command of Lord Dulmarst, and the gruff captain had no choice but to accept the charge from another High Lord. The road had grown too narrow for a large group. It proved to be a wise decision, at least for now. The farther they pressed into the rainforest, the more treacherous it became. Having that many soldiers in armor with horses could have been disastrous on the narrow paths. Janir only hoped they wouldn't have need of the soldiers later. The ground slipped under Janir's feet and she collided with the mud, accidentally jerking Kalbo's reins as she did. The stallion snorted and yanked back, stomping. "I'm sorry." Janir lent him a looser rein and pried herself from the mud. Behind her, Armandius had to stop and pull back his dappled grey steed. "Janir? Are you all right?" Saoven shouted from the front of their small column. "I'm fine," Janir answered, shuffling to her feet. Wiping a sticky lock of hair out of her eyes, she pressed on. She was already seen as the one who needed protecting. She would not become the liability. They followed a river that flowed to their right at an ever-quickening pace. They had been keeping watch for the telltale signs of a waterfall since entering the tangle of greenery. It was a welcome encouragement. Janir wondered if it were possible for them to have come 50 miles. They had kept moving for all the daylight hours and some of the night hours, but hadn't made especially good time. They kept pressing on. At this rate, Janir began to worry that their group would be far too tired to take on Zamarza. Perhaps it would be best if they found a place to rest. Perhaps it would be best if they found a place to rest for a day or two before continuing on. But she wasn't sure if that idea came from the logical part of her mind or her sore muscles, so she kept it to herself. Kalbo snorted, his head drooping. "I know, big man," Janir murmured. "I'm tired too." The stallion's ears pricked. Janir listened, half expecting a cougar's snarl or some other nefarious sound, but after a few moments she could hardly believe her ears. "I hear it," Velasquez called from the front. It wasn't Janir's imagination, then. The pounding roar of a waterfall sounded in the distance.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.